The deadliest accident in the history of aviation didn't happen miles above the Earth in a sudden nosedive. It happened right on the ground. Two massive jumbo jets collided on a stretch of tarmac where neither of them was even supposed to be. This terminal at the Gran Canaria airport is spacious, well-lit, and designed for heavy tourist traffic. But on March 27, 1977, a separatist group detonated a bomb inside a flower shop here. Shortly after, a caller warned that a second bomb was hidden somewhere inside. The authorities immediately evacuated the building and closed the airspace. This map shows what happened next. With Gran Canaria shot down, air traffic controllers diverted 6 massive flights, including 2 Boeing 747s belonging to KLM and Pan Am. They were sent directly to Los Rodeos airport on the neighboring island of Tenerife. A single localized threat on one island initiated a massive logistical chain reaction. Hundreds of passengers and thousands of tons of metal were suddenly funneled into a geographical bottleneck that was completely unprepared to handle them. As you can see in this photograph, Tenerife's Los Rodeos was not an international hub. It was a regional airstrip with a single runway and one parallel taxiway. The sudden influx of diverted jumbo jets left them awkwardly crammed together on the tarmac. The sheer volume of planes wasn't the only problem. This image shows the inside of an air traffic control tower from that era. Notice how they are relying on binoculars. Los Rodeos had only 2 controllers on duty, and they had absolutely 0 ground radar. Without radar screens to track the aircraft, the controllers were completely blind. Every single movement on the airport grounds had to be coordinated through two-way voice radio. The controllers had to trust that the pilots knew exactly where they were and were reporting their positions accurately. The entire safety net of the airport had been stripped of its technological failsafes. The lives of thousands of people now relied exclusively on human communication. To understand the massive scale of the aircraft involved, look at this KLM Boeing 747. The man in command of the KLM flight that day was Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten. He was the airline's chief flying instructor, a legendary figure whose face was printed in the airline's own promotional magazines. But even a legend is bound by the rules. Under strict Dutch labor laws, a pilot could only work a certain number of hours. If Van Zanten exceeded his flight time limit, his license could be suspended, and he could even face jail time. With the clock ticking down on his shift, Van Zanten made a fateful logistical decision. Instead of waiting to refuel at their original destination, he decided to pump 55,000 liters, an extra 50 tons of heavy fuel, into his aircraft right there on the Tenerife tarmac. The Pan Am 747 was parked directly behind KLM. Pan Am didn't need fuel, but they physically lacked the 140 feet of clearance needed to steer around the massive KLM jet. They were trapped. For 30 long minutes, the Pan Am crew sat and waited, tethering both planes to the exact same timeline. A labor law written explicitly to prevent pilot fatigue caused the exact delay that would ultimately doom both crews. Right as KLM finished refueling, the environment turned hostile. Heavy clouds rolled down from the nearby mountains, rapidly blanketing the runway in a blinding fog. Within minutes, visibility dropped to a mere 300 meters. Look at this layout of the Tenerife runway. The tower ordered the Pan Am jet to taxi directly down the active runway behind KLM, and then take the third exit, labeled C3, to get off the main strip. As the diagram shows, turning into C3 requires a punishing 135-degree backward maneuver. For a 340-ton Boeing 747 moving blindly in the fog, that turn is virtually impossible. Searching through the mist, the Pan Am crew decided to aim for the fourth exit, C4, which offered a much gentler 45-degree turn. You now have 2 heavily loaded jumbo jets moving toward each other on the exact same strip of pavement, completely invisible to the control tower and completely invisible to one another. Down at the end of the runway, Van Zanten spun his KLM jet around to face takeoff position. Desperate to beat his strict time limit, he pushed the throttle forward without asking for clearance. His co-pilot immediately stopped him, reminding the captain they hadn't been cleared. They paused. The co-pilot radioed the tower and received their route clearance, the path they would take after lifting off. But they still didn't have permission to actually take off. Van Zanten ignored this. He said, "We're going," released the brakes, and pushed the throttle forward again. Here is where the system broke down. This diagram represents the radio waves from the control tower and the Pan Am jet. Hearing KLM advancing, the tower transmitted a clear instruction to Van Zanten: "Stand by for takeoff, I will call you." In that exact same microsecond, the Pan Am crew pressed their own radio button, warning the tower, "We are still taxiing down the runway." Watch what happens when two signals transmit simultaneously on the same frequency. They overlap and scramble. This is known as the heterodyne effect. Because aviation radios work like walkie-talkies, the signals canceled each other out. Inside the KLM cockpit, instead of 2 life-saving warnings, Van Zanten's crew heard only 3.75 seconds of high-pitched static. They assumed the runway was clear. Through the thick fog, the Pan Am crew suddenly saw 2 massive landing lights hurtling directly at them. The Pan Am captain shoved his throttles to the absolute maximum, desperately trying to swerve his massive plane off the tarmac and into the grass. Inside KLM, Van Zanten finally saw the Pan Am jet and yanked his steering column back to pull his plane into the sky. But the aircraft was sluggish. The 50 tons of extra fuel he had just pumped in to save time pinned the plane down, causing the tail to drag violently along the runway. The KLM jet sliced right through the top of the Pan Am plane. 583 people died. The largest loss of life in aviation history was sealed by 3.75 seconds of invisible radio static. When you look at the charred, skeletal remains of this fuselage, it's hard to process the scale of the destruction. In the immediate aftermath, KLM executives decided to send their very best man, their head of safety, to lead the investigation. It took them hours to realize that their top safety expert was Captain Van Zanten himself. The investigation eventually looked past the fog and radio static to uncover a deeper psychological failure. Van Zanten's co-pilot had been certified by the man himself, and the flight engineer's doubts were silenced by a rigid chain of command. Neither dared to challenge the legendary captain sitting next to them. An absolute, rigid hierarchy inside the cockpit overrode training, logic, and common sense. No one questions a god. The Tenerife disaster forced a total overhaul of the aviation industry. It led directly to the creation of crew resource management. Today, co-pilots are no longer treated as subordinates who just take orders. They are rigorously trained and legally required to speak up, challenge the captain, and physically take control of the aircraft if they suspect a critical error is being made. The silence that killed 583 people is no longer allowed. The next time you're sitting on a runway, frustrated by a delay, and the pilot announces that they are waiting to double-check a clearance, remember what it took to build that system of extreme caution. The redundant checks and strict protocols used today were bought at a terrible price. In the aviation world, these rules are quite